The wolf howled somewhere in the darkness beyond the dying fire, and Grace Hartwell pulled her threadbare blanket tighter around her shaking shoulders, knowing it would do nothing against the bitter Montana cold that seeped through every crack in the ramshackle cabin walls. The winter of 1876 had come early to the mountains, and she had never felt so alone, so cold, or so certain she might not survive until spring. She had been a fool to follow Thomas out here, a damned fool to believe his promises of gold and a better life. But he had been handsome and persuasive back in St. Louis, with his tales of striking it rich in the Montana Territory, and she had been desperate enough to escape her stepfather's house that she would have followed anyone willing to take her. Thomas had painted pictures with his words of a warm cabin, furs piled high, and enough gold to buy passage to San Francisco, where they would live like royalty. Instead, he had brought her to this leaning shack 20 miles from the nearest settlement, worked a claim that yielded nothing but backache and disappointment, and then caught pneumonia in October when the first snows fell. She had buried him herself 3 weeks ago, her hands raw and bleeding from digging through the frozen ground with a rusted shovel. The grave was shallow, and she had piled rocks on top to keep the animals away, though she heard them sometimes at night, scratching and snuffling. She tried not to think about it. The fire popped, sending up a small shower of sparks, and Grace fed another precious piece of wood from her dwindling supply. She had maybe a week left if she was careful, maybe less. The food situation was even worse. A handful of beans, some flour that had weevils in it, and a strip of dried meat so hard she could barely chew it. Thomas had meant to go to town for supplies before the snow came, but he had kept putting it off, certain that tomorrow would be the day he finally struck gold. Grace was 22 years old, and she was quite certain she would die before she turned 23. The thought should have terrified her more than it did, but she was too tired and cold for proper fear. She had been cold for so long now that she could barely remember what warmth felt like. Even when she piled every scrap of fabric in the cabin on top of herself at night, she shivered until dawn, her teeth chattering so hard her jaw ached. She must have dozed off despite the cold, because the next thing she knew, something was moving outside. Not the usual sounds of small animals or wind through the pines, but something big. Heavy footsteps crunching through the snow. Grace's heart hammered against her ribs as she sat up, clutching the blanket around herself. She had Thomas's old rifle, but only 3 bullets left, and she had never been a good shot, even when her hands were not shaking from cold and hunger. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. Grace held her breath, waiting. For a long moment there was nothing but silence. Then a voice, deep and rough, called out, "Anyone alive in there?" It was a man's voice, but that did not necessarily mean safety. Grace had heard stories about what could happen to women alone in these mountains. Still, she was dying anyway. What difference did it make? "I am alive," she called back, proud that her voice did not shake as much as her hands. "What do you want?" "Saw your smoke," the man said. "Thought I should check. This cabin has been abandoned for near about 2 years, far as I knew." "My husband claimed it last summer," Grace said, then corrected herself. "My late husband." Another pause, then, "I am going to open the door now. I mean you no harm, but I am armed, so do not do anything foolish." The door swung inward, bringing with it a gust of frigid air and a man who had to duck his head to fit through the frame. Grace's first thought was that he was enormous. Not just tall, though he had to be well over 6 feet, but broad through the shoulders and chest in a way that spoke of tremendous physical strength. He wore furs and buckskin, and his dark hair fell past his shoulders, streaked with gray at the temples, though his face suggested he was not much past 35. His beard was thick and neatly trimmed, and his eyes, when they found her huddled by the fire, were a startling pale blue. He looked at her for a long moment, those blue eyes taking in her hollow cheeks, her shaking hands, the pathetic blanket pulled around her thin frame. Then his gaze swept the cabin, cataloging the bare shelves, the gaps in the walls, the complete absence of proper winter provisions. "Jesus Christ," he said quietly. "How long have you been like this?" "I am managing fine," Grace said, lifting her chin despite the fact that they both knew she was lying. The man's mouth tightened. He turned and stepped back outside without another word. Grace heard him moving around, and for a moment she wondered if he had simply left, deciding she was not worth the trouble. But then he returned, carrying what looked like half a deer carcass over one shoulder as easily as Grace might carry a loaf of bread. "When did you last eat meat?" he asked, moving to the fire without waiting for permission. "I have meat," Grace said defensively. He glanced at the strip of jerky that was more leather than food. "When did you last eat real meat?" Grace could not remember. Before Thomas died, certainly. Maybe before he got sick. "A while," she admitted. The man produced a knife from his belt that was nearly the size of Grace's forearm and began cutting strips of venison with practiced efficiency. He had brought a small iron pot with him as well, and he hung it over the fire, adding snow to melt and chunks of meat to boil. "Name is Wade Ashford," he said as he worked. "I have a cabin about 5 miles north of here, up in the high country. Do a bit of trapping, mostly keep to myself." "Grace Hartwell," she replied. "My husband and I came out from St. Louis last June." Wade nodded, not looking up from the pot. "And he died recent, you said? 3 weeks ago, pneumonia. And he left you here with no provisions, no proper shelter, and winter coming on?" There was an edge to Wade's voice now, something hard and angry. Grace felt an unexpected need to defend Thomas, even though she had been cursing his memory for weeks. He meant to get supplies. He kept thinking he would strike gold first. "There is no gold in this valley," Wade said bluntly. "Geology is all wrong. Anyone with experience could have told him that." The words settled over Grace like another blanket, but this one offered no comfort. She had suspected as much, watching Thomas chip away at the same worthless rock day after day, but hearing it confirmed made the whole terrible situation seem even more pointless. She had come all this way, lost everything, and it had all been for nothing. Wade seemed to sense her distress because his voice softened slightly. "I am sorry. That was harsh. But you need to understand the situation you are in. This cabin will not hold through a Montana winter. Your provisions would not last another week even if you knew how to hunt, which I am guessing you do not. And the nearest town is El Dorado, Kansas, which is about 1,000 miles southeast of here, so that does you no good. The nearest settlement is 20 miles through snow that is already waist-deep in places." "I know," Grace said quietly. "I know I am going to die here." Wade looked at her then, really looked at her, and something shifted in his expression. "No," he said firmly. "You are not going to die. I am not going to let that happen." Grace wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it. This stranger, appearing out of nowhere, making pronouncements about her survival as if he had any say in the matter. But she was too tired to laugh, and there was something about the certainty in his voice that made her want to believe him. The venison stew was ready faster than Grace expected, and when Wade handed her a tin cup full of meat and broth, the smell alone nearly made her weep. She forced herself to eat slowly, though her body screamed at her to devour it all at once. The hot food seemed to spread through her like sunlight, warming her from the inside in a way the fire never could. Wade ate as well, though he kept watching her, his expression unreadable. When she finished her first cup, he refilled it without asking. She ate that too, and then a third, until finally her shrunken stomach could hold no more. "Thank you," she said, and was mortified to hear her voice crack. "You can thank me by listening to what I am about to say," Wade replied. "You cannot stay here. This cabin is a death trap. Come morning, I am going to bring you back to my place. It is proper built, chinked tight, with a good chimney and enough provisions to last through spring. You can stay there until the thaw, and then we will figure out what comes next." Grace stiffened. "I cannot do that." "Why not?" "Because it would not be proper," she said. "People would talk." Wade actually laughed at that, a short bark of genuine amusement. "Lady, the nearest people are 20 miles away, and they are not going to know or care where you are. And even if they did, do you really think propriety matters more than survival?" "I do not even know you," Grace protested, though she could hear how weak the argument was. "That is fair," Wade acknowledged. "So let me tell you about myself. I am 34 years old. I came out to Montana Territory 8 years ago, after the war. I have a cabin in the mountains where I trap and hunt. I keep to myself, do not bother anyone, and no one bothers me. I have never hurt a woman in my life, and I am not about to start now. I am offering you shelter for the winter, nothing more. You will have your own space, and I will not lay a hand on you unless you ask me to, which I am guessing you will not." Grace studied him, trying to assess the truth of his words. He looked like he could snap her in half without effort, all corded muscle and raw strength barely contained beneath the furs and buckskin. But his eyes were steady and honest, and he had already demonstrated more kindness in 1 hour than Thomas had shown in their entire brief marriage. "I do not have any way to repay you," she said finally. "Did not ask you to," Wade replied. "But if it makes you feel better, you can help with cooking and mending and such. I am not much good at the domestic things." It was not a permanent solution, Grace knew that. Come spring, she would have to figure out what to do with herself, how to get back to civilization or make a life here or something. But spring was months away, and right now she was cold and desperate and running out of options. "All right," she said, "I will come with you." Wade nodded as if he had never doubted her answer. "Good. Get some sleep tonight. I will stay here and keep the fire going. In the morning, we will pack up anything you want to bring and head out." "You are going to stay here?" Grace asked, surprised. "Someone needs to make sure you do not freeze before morning," Wade said. "And I have slept in worse places." He was true to his word. Grace curled up under her inadequate blanket, and for the first time in weeks, she fell into something approaching real sleep, knowing that someone was watching over her, keeping the fire burning, keeping the darkness at bay. She woke to gray dawn light filtering through the cabin's cracks and the smell of more venison cooking. Wade was outside, and when she emerged wrapped in her blanket, she found him loading supplies onto a large roan horse that must have been tethered somewhere nearby the night before. "Take anything you want to keep," he said, gesturing at the cabin, "but travel light. We have a ways to go, and the snow is deep." Grace did not have much to pack. A few items of clothing, a photograph of her mother who had died when she was 12, a small Bible that had belonged to her grandmother. Everything else, the pans and tools and meager furnishings, belonged to the cabin or were not worth the effort of carrying. She changed into the warmest clothes she had, layering 2 dresses over her undergarments and pulling on the worn boots that were her only footwear. It was not enough, not remotely enough for a 5-mile trek through mountain snow, but it was all she had. Wade took one look at her and shook his head. He shrugged out of a fur jacket he had been wearing, revealing another layer beneath. "Put this on," he said, holding it out. "But you will be cold," Grace protested. "I have been living in these mountains for 8 years, Wade said. "I know how to handle the cold. You clearly do not. Put it on." The jacket was enormous on her, hanging past her knees and with sleeves that extended well beyond her fingertips. But it was warm, warmer than anything she had felt in months, and it smelled like pine smoke and leather and something else, something distinctly masculine that made her feel strangely safe. Wade also gave her a pair of fur-lined mittens and wrapped a thick wool scarf around her head and neck until only her eyes were visible. Then he lifted her onto the horse as if she weighed nothing at all and swung up behind her. "Hold on," he said, and Grace gripped the saddle horn as the horse began moving through the deep snow. The journey was both longer and shorter than Grace expected. The landscape was breathtaking, towering pines laden with snow and mountains rising like cathedral spires against the pale sky. But the cold was brutal despite the borrowed furs, seeping through every layer and making her bones ache. She found herself leaning back against Wade's solid warmth without consciously deciding to do so, and if he noticed, he did not comment. They stopped once so Wade could clear a fallen tree from the path, his powerful arms making short work of the obstacle. Grace watched him work, fascinated despite herself by the easy competence with which he moved, the way his muscles bunched and flexed beneath his remaining layers. He was unlike any man she had ever known, shaped by this harsh land into something almost elemental. When they finally reached Wade's cabin, Grace understood immediately why he had been so dismissive of her shelter. This was a real home, built solid from hewn logs with careful chinking and a stone chimney that spoke of permanent habitation. It was set in a small clearing surrounded by pines, with a lean-to stable for the horse and what looked like a smokehouse and other outbuildings. Inside was even better. The main room held a large stone fireplace, a sturdy table with 2 chairs, shelves lined with provisions, and even a few books. A bearskin rug covered part of the floor, and there was a proper bed frame in one corner with what looked like multiple thick furs for blankets. A ladder led to a loft space above. "You will take the bed," Wade said, following her gaze. I will sleep in the loft. Grace wanted to argue, but she was too overwhelmed by the warmth and the sudden safety to protest. Wade built up the fire while she stood in the middle of the room, still wrapped in his borrowed furs, trying to process the sudden change in her circumstances. "Why are you doing this?" she asked finally. Wade paused in his work, considering the question. "I told you I am not going to let you die, but why do you care? You do not know me." He was quiet for a long moment, staring into the growing flames. When he spoke, his voice was low. "I had a sister once, Mary. She got married young to a man who promised her the world. He brought her out west, and he was about as worthless as they come. She died the winter of '68, froze to death in a cabin not much better than the one I found you in. I was still in the army, did not even know she was out here until I got the letter saying she was gone." Grace felt her throat tighten. "I am sorry. So when I saw you last night, cold and starving and alone because some damned fool dragged you out here and left you with nothing." He shook his head. "I could not walk away. I would not. I remind you of her," Grace said softly. "Maybe," Wade admitted. "Or maybe I just cannot stand the thought of another woman dying alone in these mountains because the men in her life failed her." Grace did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing. Instead, she moved closer to the fire, letting the heat soak into her bones, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt something like hope. The first few days in Wade's cabin passed in a blur of warmth and food and actual rest. Grace slept for what felt like days, waking only to eat the meals Wade prepared, and then falling back into exhausted slumber. Her body, pushed to the edge of survival for so long, demanded the rest it had been denied. When she finally emerged from the fog of exhaustion, she began to notice the details of her new surroundings. The cabin was meticulously maintained, everything in its place, and built to last. Wade clearly knew what he was doing. The shelves held sacks of flour and cornmeal, dried beans, coffee, sugar, salt, and other staples. Strings of dried meat and herbs hung from the rafters. There were steel traps hanging on the wall, cleaned and oiled, and a rifle that was much better maintained than Thomas's had been. Wade himself was out most days, checking his trap lines or hunting. He left early and returned by afternoon, always bringing something with him. Rabbit, venison, once a turkey that provided several days of meals. He moved through the wilderness with the confidence of someone completely at home in it, and Grace found herself watching him with something like awe. He had given her space, as promised. He slept in the loft, ate his meals quickly, and did not pry into her past beyond what she had already told him. But she could feel his attention on her sometimes, those pale blue eyes assessing, making sure she was all right. One morning, about a week after her arrival, Grace woke to find a large bundle on the table. Wade was already up, working on something by the fire. "What is this?" she asked. "Open it," he said without turning around. Grace unfolded the bundle and caught her breath. It was a hide, a massive grizzly bear hide, the fur thick and lustrous and bigger than any blanket she had ever seen. It had been carefully cleaned and cured, soft and supple to the touch. "I killed that bear 2 months back," Wade said. "Been working on the hide when I have time. Figured you could use a proper blanket. Montana winters are not kind, and what you had would not have kept a cat warm." Grace ran her hands over the incredible fur, feeling tears prick her eyes. It was the most thoughtful gift anyone had ever given her, this recognition of her need, this tangible proof that someone cared whether she lived or died. "I do not know what to say," she whispered. "Do not say anything," Wade replied. "Just stay warm." That night, Grace wrapped herself in the grizzly hide and felt warmth like she had never known. The fur was so thick and insulating that she felt cocooned, protected, safe. For the first time in years, since before she had left St. Louis, since before her mother had died, she slept without shivering, without the bone-deep cold that had become her constant companion. She woke with tears on her cheeks, overwhelmed by the simple gift of warmth, and made a decision. She could not just take Wade's charity without giving something back. She might not know how to hunt or trap, but she knew how to keep a house, how to cook and clean and mend. She would make herself useful. Wade seemed surprised the next morning when he came down from the loft to find breakfast already prepared, hot coffee waiting, and the cabin swept clean. But he did not object, just nodded his thanks and ate the Johnny cakes and fried salt pork she had prepared. Over the following weeks, they fell into a routine. Wade handled the outdoor work, the hunting and trapping and wood splitting that kept them fed and warm. Grace managed the domestic sphere, cooking and cleaning and mending his clothes when she found items that needed repair. They spoke little at first, circling each other like cautious animals, but gradually they began to talk. Grace learned that Wade had grown up in Kentucky, the oldest of 4 children. He had fought for the Union during the war, seen things he did not want to talk about, and come west afterward to escape the memories. He had tried living in town for a while, working as a blacksmith, but he could not bear the noise and the crowds. So he had moved into the mountains, built his cabin, and found peace in the solitude. Wade learned that Grace's mother had died of consumption when Grace was 12, leaving her in the care of a stepfather who saw her as a burden and then as something worse. She had run away at 18, worked as a seamstress in St. Louis for 4 years, barely scraping by, until Thomas had swept into her life with his promises of gold and adventure. She had known deep down that it was too good to be true, but she had been desperate enough to believe anyway. "I was a fool," she said one evening as they sat by the fire, her working on mending one of Wade's shirts, him cleaning his rifle. "You were desperate," Wade corrected. "That is different. Desperation makes us all do things we would not otherwise do." "You do not seem like you have ever been desperate," Grace observed. Wade was quiet for a moment. "I was desperate after the war," he said finally. "Desperate to feel like a human being again. Desperate to stop seeing the things I had seen every time I closed my eyes. I drank myself halfway to death that first year. Would have succeeded, probably, if I had not run out of money and been forced to sober up." Grace looked at him with new eyes, seeing past the strength and competence to the scars beneath. "What changed?" "I came out here," he said simply. "Found out that if I kept my hands busy and my mind focused on survival, the memories did not crowd in so much, and after a while, I stopped wanting to die, started wanting to live again." "I am glad you did," Grace said softly. Wade looked at her, something shifting in his expression. "I am too," he said, "especially now." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning neither of them was quite ready to examine. Grace ducked her head back to her mending, her heart beating faster than it should. As December deepened and the snow piled higher, Grace found herself noticing things about Wade that had nothing to do with gratitude. The way his hands, so strong and capable, could also be so surprisingly gentle when he was working on something delicate. The rare smile that transformed his stern face into something almost boyish. The sound of his voice, rough and low, when he read aloud from one of his few books in the evenings. She noticed, too, that he watched her when he thought she was not looking, his gaze lingering on her face, her hands, the curve of her neck. There was nothing predatory in it, nothing that made her uncomfortable. Instead, it made her feel seen in a way she never had before, as if he was really looking at her, Grace, not just a woman or a burden or a potential wife. One afternoon in mid-December, Grace was preparing stew when Wade came in from checking his traps, his expression troubled. "Storm coming," he said, moving to the window. "Big one, from the look of the sky. We might be stuck inside for a few days." "We have plenty of provisions," Grace said. "We will be fine." Wade nodded, but he spent the rest of the afternoon bringing in extra firewood, checking the chimney, making sure everything was secure. Grace helped where she could, following his terse instructions, sensing his concern. The storm hit just after dark, and it was like nothing Grace had ever experienced. The wind howled like a living thing, battering the cabin with fists of snow and ice. The temperature dropped so fast that frost formed on the inside of the window, and even with the fire roaring, the cabin grew noticeably colder. Wade brought down extra furs from the loft, piling them on the bed. "Stay close to the fire," he said. "This is going to be a rough night." He was right. As the hours wore on, the cold became almost unbearable despite the fire. Grace wrapped herself in the grizzly hide and every other fur Wade gave her, but still, she shivered. Wade paced the cabin, periodically checking the chimney and the door, making sure the snow was not blocking their ventilation. Around midnight, Grace's teeth were chattering so hard she could not speak. Wade looked at her, seemed to make a decision, and said, "This is foolish. We need to share body heat or we are both going to freeze." Grace knew he was right, knew that propriety meant nothing against this brutal cold, but still she hesitated. "I gave you my word I would not touch you," Wade said quietly, And I mean to keep it, but if we do not get warm, we are not going to survive the night. Please, Grace." She nodded, and Wade climbed into the bed behind her, wrapping his arms around her and pulling her back against his chest. The heat of him was immediate and shocking, like pressing against a furnace. Grace gasped and then relaxed into the incredible warmth of another human body, the safety of his strong arms around her. Wade pulled all the furs over them both, creating a cocoon of warmth, and gradually, finally, Grace stopped shivering. She could feel the steady thump of his heart against her back, the rise and fall of his breathing, the solid strength of his body surrounding her. "Better?" he asked, his voice a rumble in his chest. "Yes," Grace whispered. "Thank you." "Go to sleep," Wade said. "I will keep you safe." And she did, falling into the deepest, warmest sleep she had known in years, wrapped in a grizzly hide and the arms of a mountain man who had saved her life. The storm lasted 3 days. For 3 days, Grace and Wade barely left the bed except to tend the fire and take care of necessities. They slept curled together like hibernating animals, sharing warmth and stories and, gradually, pieces of themselves they had never shared with anyone else. Grace told him about her mother, how she had taught Grace to sew and read and dream of a better life, how she had wasted away slowly, apologizing with her last breath for leaving Grace alone, how her stepfather had been kind at first, then cold, then something worse, until Grace had fled in the night with nothing but the clothes on her back and her grandmother's Bible. Wade told her about the war, not the details but the shape of it, the way it had broken something in him that he was still trying to fix. About his sister Mary, who had been his favorite person in the world, how she used to braid wildflowers in her hair and sing while she worked, how getting the letter about her death had nearly destroyed him, how he had blamed himself for not being there, not protecting her. "It was not your fault," Grace said fiercely. "You could not have known." "Maybe not," Wade said, "but I can do something now. I can make sure you do not suffer the same fate." "You already have," Grace said. "You saved me, Wade. I would have died in that cabin if you had not come along." "I am glad I found you," Wade said, his arms tightening around her. "So damned glad." Grace turned in his embrace, needing to see his face. In the firelight, his features were all hard planes and shadows, but his eyes were soft, almost vulnerable. "I am glad too," she whispered. They looked at each other for a long moment, something building between them, something that had been growing since that first night, but was only now becoming impossible to ignore. Wade raised one hand slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and cupped her cheek. "Grace," he said, his voice rough, "I need to know, is this gratitude, or is it something more?" Grace considered lying, considered hiding behind the safer excuse of gratitude. But she had been lying to herself for too long, pretending she did not notice the way her heart raced when he came home, the way she found excuses to stand close to him, the way she felt safe and seen and cherished for the first time in her life. "It is more," she said. "I do not know when it happened, but it is more." Wade closed his eyes as if her words had struck him. "I am too old for you," he said. "Too rough, too damaged. You deserve better than a hermit mountain man." "I deserve someone who sees me," Grace said. "Someone who cares whether I live or die. Someone who gives me a blanket made from a grizzly hide because he does not want me to be cold." She put her hand over his where it rested on her cheek. "You are not too anything, Wade Ashford. You are exactly what I need." "Grace," he said again, and then he was kissing her, soft and careful, as if she were something precious that might break. Grace kissed him back, pouring all her gratitude and need and growing love into it, and Wade made a sound low in his throat and gathered her closer. They kissed until the fire burned low, until the cabin grew cold again and they had to break apart to add more wood. Wade was breathing hard, his eyes dark with wanting, but he made no move to take things further. "We should wait," he said. "Do this properly. I want to marry you, Grace, if you will have me. But I want you to be sure. I want you to have time to think about what you are choosing." "I am sure," Grace said, but Wade shook his head. "Wait until spring," he said, "when the snow melts and you have the option to leave if you want to. If you still feel the same way then, I will marry you in a heartbeat and spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret it." Grace wanted to argue, wanted to tell him she already knew her own heart, but she could see the fear beneath his resolve, the terror that she only wanted him out of desperation or gratitude, that she would wake up one day and realize she had made a terrible mistake. So she nodded, and they settled back into the bed, wrapped in each other and the grizzly hide, and waited for the storm to pass. When the snow finally stopped and they emerged from the cabin, the world was transformed. Everything was buried under feet of fresh powder, pristine and glittering in the weak winter sunlight. Wade had to dig out the door and then spend hours clearing a path to the woodshed and the lean to where the horse was sheltered. Grace helped where she could, though she quickly learned she was more hindrance than help in the deep snow. Instead, she focused on keeping the cabin warm and preparing hot meals for when Wade came in from his labors. She watched him work from the window, marveling at his strength, the way he never seemed to tire even after hours of shoveling. That night, they did not share the bed. The worst of the cold had passed with the storm, and Wade insisted on returning to the loft. Grace missed his warmth, missed the safety of his arms, but she understood what he was doing. He was giving her space, giving her time, proving that he could keep his word even when it clearly cost him. She lay alone under the grizzly hide and thought about the future. Spring was months away, and anything could happen in that time, but Grace already knew what her answer would be. She had been alone for so long, cold for so long, and now she had found warmth in more than just a fur blanket. She had found it in Wade's steady presence, his quiet competence, his fierce determination to protect her. She had found it in the way he looked at her like she mattered, like she was worth saving, worth keeping. She was not fool enough to think it would be easy. Life in these mountains was brutal, and Wade's solitary existence would be a hard adjustment. But it would be her choice, her life, built on honesty and mutual respect rather than pretty lies and broken promises. That meant something. That meant everything. Christmas came and went, marked only by Wade bringing home a wild turkey and Grace using some of their precious sugar to make a simple cake. They ate by firelight and exchanged small gifts. Grace gave Wade a new shirt she had sewn from fabric she found in his supplies, fitted properly to his broad shoulders. Wade gave her a pair of fur-lined boots he had made, sized perfectly for her feet. For spring, he said, when the trails thaw and we can go into town, you will need proper boots. When we go into town, Grace asked, together? If that is what you want, Wade said carefully, I would introduce you as my wife if you will have me by then. I will have you now, Grace said. I told you I am already sure. Spring, Wade said firmly. That is the deal. Grace sighed but did not argue. She put on the boots and walked around the cabin, feeling the difference proper footwear made. Everything Wade made was built to last, built to protect. It was who he was down to his bones. January was brutally cold, but the cabin held strong and their provisions lasted. Wade continued to hunt and check his traps, though the yield was sparse in the deep winter. Grace learned to help with the furs, scraping and cleaning hides under Wade's patient instruction. It was hard work, but she found satisfaction in it, in learning the skills she would need to truly be a mountain wife. They grew closer in the long winter evenings, talking and reading, and sometimes just sitting in comfortable silence. Wade taught her to shoot, first with a rifle and then with the pistol he kept for emergencies. She was not a natural shot, but she improved with practice, and Wade was endlessly patient, adjusting her stance and aim until she could hit a target more often than not. A woman alone in these mountains needs to know how to protect herself, he said, even if I plan to make sure you are never alone again. Grace learned to read the weather the way Wade did, to know when a storm was coming by the quality of the light and the behavior of the birds. She learned which plants could be eaten and which were poison, which trees burned best and which made too much smoke. She learned the rhythms of this life, harsh and simple and honest, in a way her time in St. Louis had never been, and through it all, her feelings for Wade deepened from attraction and gratitude into something richer and more enduring. She loved the way he moved, economical and purposeful. She loved his rare smiles, earned and genuine. She loved his hands, scarred and calloused, so capable of both violence and tenderness. She loved his voice, the way it rumbled through her when they sat close to the fire. She loved him, simply and completely, in a way she had never loved Thomas, in a way she had not known she was capable of. She thought he loved her too, though he never said the words. She saw it in the way he brought her wildflowers preserved in snow, just because. in the way he carved her a proper comb from antler when he noticed her struggling with her hair, in the way he watched her when he thought she was not looking, his expression soft and wondering, as if he could not quite believe she was real. February brought a brief thaw, and Wade took advantage of it to make the journey to the nearest settlement, a rough collection of cabins and a trading post about 20 miles south. He was gone for 3 days, and Grace spent the time worrying and pacing, terrified that something would happen to him, that he would not come back, that she would be alone again. But he returned safe, bringing supplies and news in a package he would not let her see. For later, he said cryptically when she asked. March arrived with more snow, a late storm that buried them for another week. But the days were getting longer, the sun stronger, and Grace could feel the land beginning to wake up beneath its white blanket. Wade grew restless, watching the sky, testing the snow depth, calculating when the high passes would be clear enough to travel. Another month, he said one evening, maybe less. Then we can head down to the settlement, find a preacher if you still want to marry me. I want to marry you, Grace said. I've wanted to marry you since December. Wade smiled, one of his rare full smiles that transformed his entire face. I have wanted to marry you since the day I found you freezing in that death-trap cabin, he admitted. But I needed to know you were choosing this life, not just accepting it because you had no choice. I am choosing you, Grace said firmly. This life, this place, you, all of it, I choose it. Wade crossed the room in 2 long strides and pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a passion that made her knees weak. I love you, he said against her mouth. God help me, I love you so much it terrifies me. I love you too, Grace said, tears streaming down her face. I love you too. They held each other as the fire crackled and the wind howled outside. 2 people who had found each other against all odds, who had chosen warmth over cold, life over death, love over solitude. April finally came, and with it the thaw. The snow began to recede, revealing the brown earth beneath. Streams swelled with meltwater, and the first brave shoots of green pushed through the mud. Birds returned, filling the air with song, and the forest came alive with the sounds of animals emerging from their winter sleep. Wade declared the trails passable in mid-April, and they prepared for the journey to the settlement. Grace wore her fur-lined boots and the warmest of her layered dresses, and Wade packed supplies for the 2-day journey. He seemed nervous in a way Grace had never seen him, fidgeting with his gear and checking everything twice. What is wrong? She asked finally. Wade took a deep breath. I need to do this right, he said. He reached into his pack and pulled out the mysterious package from his February trip, unwrapping it to reveal a simple gold ring. I know I already asked, he said, his voice rough with emotion, but I want to do it properly this time. He dropped to one knee in the mud and melting snow, this huge, strong man, and took her hand. Grace Hartwell, you came into my life when I thought I would be alone forever. You brought light and warmth and laughter into this cabin, into my heart. You are the bravest, strongest woman I have ever known, and I would be honored if you would consent to be my wife. Will you marry me? Grace was crying openly now, tears of joy running down her face. Yes, she said, yes, 1,000 times yes. Wade slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. Then he stood and kissed her, deep and slow, a promise of all the years to come. They rode out the next morning, Grace seated in front of Wade on his big roan horse, following the trails that were slowly emerging from the snow. The journey was long and muddy, but Grace did not care. She was warm in her furs, safe in Wade's arms, and going toward a future she had chosen for herself. The settlement was rough, just as Wade had described, but it had a trading post and a small church and a circuit preacher who happened to be making his monthly rounds. The preacher, a weathered man named Reverend Miller, agreed to marry them that very afternoon in the small log church. Grace wore her cleanest dress, and Wade had shaved his beard down to something more civilized, though he had kept his long hair tied back with a leather cord. They stood before the preacher with only the trading post owner and his wife as witnesses, and spoke their vows with hands clasped and eyes locked on each other. I, Wade, take you, Grace, to be my lawfully wedded wife, Wade said, his voice steady and sure. I promise to protect you, provide for you, and love you for all the days of my life. I, Grace, take you, Wade, to be my lawfully wedded husband, Grace replied, her voice clear despite the tears streaming down her face. I promise to stand beside you, support you, and love you for all the days of my life." The ring Wade had bought slipped onto her finger again, blessed this time by the preacher's words. And when Reverend Miller pronounced them husband and wife, Wade kissed her with a tenderness that made Grace's heart overflow. They spent their wedding night in a rough room above the trading post, the first time they had been together as husband and wife in truth. Wade was gentle and patient, his roughness tempered by genuine care for Grace's comfort and pleasure. He had been a soldier and a mountain man, but he loved her with a sweetness that surprised them both. Afterward, lying in Wade's arms in a bed that was not nearly as comfortable as the one in their cabin, Grace felt a completeness she had never known. This man, this life, this fierce and honest love, it was everything she had not known she needed. "Are you happy?" Wade asked, his fingers tracing patterns on her bare shoulder. "I did not know I could be this happy," Grace admitted. "I thought I would die alone and cold in Thomas's cabin, and instead, I found you." "I found you," Wade corrected, "and I am never letting you go." They returned to the cabin a few days later, stopping to purchase a few supplies but mostly eager to get home. Home. The word felt right now, felt true. The cabin in the mountains was not just Wade's anymore. It was theirs, the place where they would build their life together. Summer in the Montana mountains was brief but glorious. The meadows exploded with wildflowers, and the streams ran clear and cold with snowmelt. Wade taught Grace to fish and to identify the edible plants that grew in abundance. They worked together to expand the garden plot, planting vegetables that would help sustain them through the next winter. Grace flourished in the mountain air, her body growing stronger from the physical work, her face taking on color from the sun. She learned to move through the wilderness with more confidence, to read the signs Wade showed her, to be a true partner in this life rather than a burden to be protected. They made love often that first summer, learning each other's bodies with the patience of people who had all the time in the world. Wade was endlessly fascinated by Grace's softness, the curve of her hip, the hollow of her throat. Grace marveled at Wade's strength, the hard planes of his muscled body, the way he could lift her as if she weighed nothing and then hold her with infinite gentleness. In August, Grace realized she was pregnant. She had missed her monthly corsets twice and was sick in the mornings, and though she was nervous, she was also thrilled. Wade's reaction when she told him was everything she could have hoped for. He picked her up and spun her around, then immediately set her down with an apology, worried he had been too rough. "We are going to have a baby," he said, wonder in his voice. "Grace, we are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Grace asked, suddenly uncertain. "Happy?" Wade laughed, the sound echoing through the cabin. "I am terrified and thrilled and so damned happy I could burst. You have given me everything, Grace. Everything." He was protective before, but now he was almost comically so, insisting Grace rest while he handled all the heavy work. Bringing her special foods, he thought, might help with the sickness, reading to her in the evenings with one large hand spread protectively over her. Still flat belly. Fall came, painting the mountains in gold and crimson, and they prepared for another winter. But this time, Grace was not afraid. The cabin was warm and well stocked, the shelves groaning under the weight of their provisions. She had her grizzly hide blanket, sewn now into a proper cover for their bed, and she had Wade, her husband, her love, her protector. Winter settled in again, but it was nothing like the previous year. Grace spent the short, dark days sewing baby clothes from soft scraps of fabric, while Wade carved a cradle from pine, working the wood smooth until there were no splinters to threaten delicate skin. They talked about names in the evenings, considering and rejecting options. If it was a boy, they agreed on William, after Wade's father. If it was a girl, they could not decide between several options, so they agreed to wait until they saw her face. The baby came in late March, during the first real thaw, as if he had been waiting for the promise of spring. The labor was long and difficult, and there was no doctor within 20 miles, but Wade stayed with Grace through all of it, holding her hand and wiping her forehead and telling her how strong she was, how brave. When their son finally arrived, red-faced and wailing, Wade cut the cord with his hunting knife and wrapped the baby in soft furs before placing him in Grace's arms. She looked down at the tiny face, the shock of dark hair, the waving fists, and felt her heart expand in ways she had not known were possible. "William," she said softly. "Hello." William. Wade was crying openly, tears streaming into his beard as he looked at his wife and son. "He is perfect," he said. "You are both perfect." Those first weeks with a newborn were exhausting and wonderful and terrifying all at once. William was a good baby, nursing well and sleeping in reasonable stretches. But Grace still found herself overwhelmed by the responsibility of keeping this tiny human alive. Wade helped as much as he could, walking the baby when he fussed, changing soiled cloths without complaint, taking on even more of the household works so Grace could rest. "You are a natural father," Grace told him one evening, watching him cradle their sleeping son against his broad chest. "I am just trying not to break him," Wade said, but he was smiling, that soft smile he reserved for Grace and now for William. Summer returned, and they fell into a new rhythm, life with a baby woven into the familiar patterns of mountain living. Wade built a sling so Grace could carry William while she worked in the garden, and the baby seemed to enjoy the fresh air and sunshine, gurgling happily as his mother moved through her tasks. They made the trip to the settlement in August, William now 5 months old and thriving. Grace wanted the Reverend to bless their son, and Wade needed to trade some of his winter furs. The settlement had grown slightly in the 2 years since their wedding, and there were a few more families now, including one other woman with a young child. Mary Patterson, the other mother, was delighted to meet Grace, hungry for adult female conversation in this male-dominated wilderness. They talked about babies and recipes and the challenges of mountain life while their children played in the dirt, and Grace realized how much she had missed having a woman friend. "You should come visit when you can," Mary said. "It is not so very far, and it would be lovely to have company." Grace promised as she would, and as they rode home, she mentioned it to Wade. "I think that is a fine idea," he said. "You should have friends, people besides just me, as long as you always come home." "Always," Grace promised. "You and William are my home now." The years that followed were full and rich, though not without their challenges. They lost a baby, a daughter born too early one harsh February, and Grace grieved deeply, holding the tiny body and weeping while Wade held them both. They buried her on the hillside behind the cabin beneath a pine tree and planted wildflowers on the grave come spring. But life continued, as it always does. William grew into a sturdy, curious boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's determination. Grace gave birth to a daughter 2 years after losing the first, a healthy baby girl they named Sarah, and then another son, Jacob. 18 months after that, the cabin grew with the family. Wade added a loft room for the children and expanded the main room, building more shelves and a larger table. He taught William to hunt and fish, passing on the skills he had learned, and Grace taught Sarah to sew and cook and read from the small collection of books they had accumulated. Grace made to visit Mary Patterson several times a year, and Mary came to their cabin as well, the two women becoming fast friends despite the distance between them. It was good to have that connection, that reminder that they were not entirely isolated, that there was a community of sorts in these vast mountains. The children brought joy and chaos in equal measure, and Grace marveled sometimes at how different her life had become. She had gone from freezing and alone in a collapsing cabin to a mother of 3, a mountain wife who could shoot a rifle and cure a hide and deliver a baby if necessary. She had gone from believing she would die unloved to being cherished by a man who still looked at her like she was the most precious thing in his world. Wade's hair had gone more gray, and there were lines around his eyes from squinting at the sun, but he was still strong, still capable, still the protector and provider he had been from the beginning. He was gentle with the children, patient with their questions and games, but firm when discipline was needed. He was, Grace thought, the father she wished she had known as a child. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Wade surprised Grace by taking her back to the settlement, leaving the children with Mary Patterson for a few days. They stayed in the same rough room above the trading post where they had spent their wedding night and made love like newlyweds, reveling in the rare privacy. "Do you ever regret it?" Wade asked afterward, holding her close. "This life, being stuck in the mountains with me?" "Never," Grace said firmly. "Not once. You saved my life, Wade, and then you gave me a life worth living." "You saved me too," Wade said. "I did not realize how lonely I was until you were here, how empty this cabin was. You filled it with light and love and laughter. You gave me a family. You gave me everything." They lay together in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the settlement outside, and Grace thought about the girl she had been, cold and desperate, and certain she was going to die. That girl would not recognize the woman she had become, strong and confident and deeply, profoundly happy. The children grew, as children do. William became a skilled hunter, often going out with his father on extended trips into the high country. Sarah had her mother's talent with a needle and spent hours sewing beautiful quilts from scraps. Jacob was the wild one, always climbing trees and exploring and giving his parents heart attacks with his fearlessness. Grace and Wade grew older together, their bodies marked by the passage of time and the harshness of mountain life, but their love only deepened. They had built something real and lasting, a family and a home in one of the most unforgiving places on earth. When William was 16, he announced his intention to strike out on his own, to try his hand at trapping in the high country. Grace's heart broke a little, but she understood. He was his father's son, shaped by these mountains, and he needed to find his own path. Wade helped him build a cabin of his own, a day's ride from theirs, and taught him everything he knew about surviving alone in the wilderness. But Grace made him promise to come home regularly, to not disappear into the mountains the way Wade had before she found him. "I will, Ma," William promised. "I could never stay away from your cooking for too long anyway." Sarah married at 18 to a young man from the settlement, a carpenter's son who treated her with respect and obvious adoration. Grace cried at the wedding, held in the same small church where she and Wade had married, and Wade held her hand and whispered that their daughter would be happy, that the boy was a good man. Jacob showed no signs of settling down, still wild and free at 20, trapping with his brother sometimes and helping his father other times, but mostly roaming the mountains like he owned them. Grace and Wade found themselves alone again, the cabin quiet after years of children's noise. It was an adjustment, but Grace found she did not mind. She had Wade, her first love and her last, and that was enough. They were sitting by the fire one winter evening, Grace now in her 50s and Wade approaching 60, when Grace said, "Do you remember that grizzly hide blanket you made me?" "Of course," Wade said. "Why?" "I was just thinking about how that was the first night I slept warm in years, the first time I felt truly safe." Grace smiled. "It is still my favorite blanket." "It is getting a bit worn," Wade observed. "Maybe I should hunt another grizzly, make you a new one." "Do not you dare," Grace said. "That blanket has seen me through 10 winters and 3 babies. It is ours. I am keeping it forever." Wade laughed and pulled her close. "You were half frozen and starving when I found you. I could see your bones through your skin. And now look at you, strong and healthy and beautiful." "I am old," Grace said, though she was smiling. "We are both old," Wade agreed. "But I love you just as much now as I did that first winter. More, maybe." "More," Grace agreed. "Definitely more." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire, wrapped in furs and in each other, and Grace thought about the strange, winding path that had brought her to this moment. From St. Louis to a death-trap cabin, to a mountain man's arms, to a full, rich life she never could have imagined. She had been so cold for so long. And then Wade had wrapped her in a grizzly hide, and she had slept warm for the first time in years. But the blanket was only the beginning. Wade had warmed her heart, her soul, her entire life with his steady love and fierce protection. The winters still came, harsh and unforgiving, but Grace no longer feared them. She had Wade, she had their children, and now grandchildren who visited regularly. She had a home built on love and hard work and mutual respect. She had survived, and more than that, she had thrived. As the fire burned low and Wade's breathing deepened into sleep, Grace pulled the old grizzly hide higher around them both. It was worn now, the fur not as thick as it once was, but it was still warm, still a reminder of everything they had built together. Outside, the wind howled through the pines and the snow fell softly, blanketing the world in white. But inside the cabin, Grace was warm, safe, and home. And that, she thought, as she drifted off to sleep, was worth more than all the gold in Montana. The years continued their steady march, bringing changes both welcome and bittersweet. William had found himself a wife, a strong mountain woman named Anne, who could shoot as well as any man, and who gave Grace and Wade 3 sturdy grandchildren. Sarah and her carpenter husband had settled in a growing town 2 days' ride away, adding 2 more grandchildren to the growing family. Even Jacob eventually found a woman who could match his wildness, a trapper's daughter named Lucy, and they built a cabin near Williams, raising their family in the shadow of the peaks. Grace and Wade became the patriarch and matriarch of a small mountain clan, the cabin that had once housed just Wade's solitary existence now, the gathering place for children and grandchildren who came to visit, to learn, to hear stories of the old days. The grandchildren loved hearing about how Grace and Wade had met, about the terrible winter and the grizzly hide blanket. Grace would bring it out sometimes, the old fur now patched and mended but still intact, and let the children touch it, feel its warmth, understand what it meant to her. Grandpa saved Grandma's life, the children would say with awe, looking at Wade as if he were a hero from a storybook. Grandma saved mine right back, Wade would always reply, his eyes finding Grace across the room, still full of that same wonder and love that had been there from the beginning. Time was not without its difficulties. Wade's joints grew stiff in the cold, the legacy of too many years in harsh weather. Grace's eyesight dimmed, making the fine needlework she loved more challenging. But they adapted, helping each other, leaning on each other, the partnership they had forged in that first desperate winter, growing only stronger with time. On their 25th anniversary, their children and grandchildren gathered at the cabin for a celebration. The small space was packed with people and laughter and love, and Grace looked around at the family they had created and felt her heart might burst from happiness. William stood and raised a tin cup in toast. To Ma and Pa, he said, who taught us what real love looks like, what real strength looks like, who built a life in these mountains and raised us to do the same, to the best parents anyone could ask for. The gathered family echoed the toast, and Grace found herself crying happy tears while Wade held her hand under the table, his grip still strong despite the years. That night, after everyone had left or settled down to sleep in various corners of the cabin and the added lean-to, Grace and Wade lay in their bed under the old grizzly hide, listening to the sounds of their family sleeping around them. "We did all right," Wade said softly. "Did we not?" "We did more than all right," Grace said. "We built something beautiful." "You built something beautiful," Wade corrected. "I just provided the walls. You filled them with life." "We did it together," Grace insisted. "Everything together. As they had always done, as they always would." The following winter was particularly harsh, reminding Grace of that first terrible season. The snow came early and stayed late, and the cold was bitter. But the cabin held strong, as it always had, and Grace spent the long evenings by the fire, wrapped in her grizzly hide, working on a quilt for her newest great-grandchild. Wade was outside less than he used to be, the cold bothering his old war wounds and the general aches of age, but he kept busy maintaining their trap lines close to home and keeping the firewood supply constant. He still read to Grace in the evenings, his voice perhaps not as strong as it once was, but still comforting, still home. Spring came late that year, but when it finally arrived, it was glorious. The meadows erupted with wild flowers, and the family gathered again for Easter, celebrating in the small church, in the settlement that had grown into a proper town now, with a school and a doctor and everything a community needed. Grace was 70 years old that spring, and Wade 72, and they moved a bit slower than they used to, needed a bit more help getting around. But their minds were sharp and their love was strong, and that was what mattered. The summer brought unexpected news. The railroad was pushing through the territory, and there was talk of Montana becoming a state soon. The world was changing, growing more civilized, more connected. Some of the younger folks were excited about it, but Grace found she preferred the old ways, the quiet isolation of their mountain home. "Do you think we should move to town?" Wade asked one evening. "It might be easier as we get older, closer to the doctor, to the children." Grace was quiet for a long moment, considering. "Do you want to?" she asked finally. "No," Wade admitted. "I have spent my whole adult life in these mountains. I do not think I could bear to leave now." "Then we stay," Grace said firmly. "We stay in our home, in the place where we built our life. The children can visit, and if we need help, they are close enough. But this is where we belong." Wade smiled, that soft smile that was hers alone. "I love you, Grace Ashford. I loved you too, Wade Ashford. Always have, always will." They stayed, through summers and winters, through visits from children and great-grandchildren who filled the cabin with noise and joy, through the aches and pains of aging bodies, through the small losses and the great joys that make up a life. Grace was 75 when Wade got sick. It started as a cough, nothing unusual for winter, but it settled deep in his chest and would not leave. William wanted to take him to the doctor in town, but Wade refused. "I am not dying in some strange bed," he said stubbornly. "If my time has come, I will meet it here, in my own home, with my wife beside me." Grace nursed him as best she could, making broths and teas, keeping him warm, reading to him when he was too weak to hold a book himself. The children came to visit, said their goodbyes, though Wade rallied enough to grumble that they were being dramatic. But Grace knew. She had seen death enough times to recognize its approach. She sat beside Wade's bed, holding his hand, and talked to him about their life together, about the day he had found her, about their wedding, about the births of their children, about all the small, perfect moments that had made up their decades together. "I do not regret a single day," Wade said, his voice weak but clear, "not one day of loving you." "I do not either," Grace said, tears streaming down her face. "You gave me everything, Wade, everything." He died on a cold February morning, just as the sun was rising over the peaks, painting the snow pink and gold. Grace was holding his hand, and she felt the moment he left, felt the absence of him like a physical blow. The children came and helped her prepare his body, and they buried him on the hillside behind the cabin, next to the daughter they had lost so many years ago. The whole family gathered for the funeral, and half the town came too, people who had known Wade as a fair trader, a skilled hunter, a good man. Grace stood at the graveside, wrapped in her old grizzly hide against the cold, and said goodbye to the man who had been her salvation, her partner, her great love. And then she returned to the cabin and tried to figure out how to live without him. It was harder than anything she had ever done. The cabin felt empty without Wade's presence, without his voice, without the knowledge that he was there, solid and dependable, always. Grace moved through her days mechanically, cooking meals she barely ate, tending a fire that never seemed to warm her. The children wanted her to move to town, to live with one of them, but Grace refused. This was her home. This was where she had been happy, where she had built a life with Wade. She would not abandon it now. William moved his family closer, building a cabin just a mile away so someone could check on Grace daily. Sarah visited as often as she could, bringing food and company. Jacob stopped by between his wanderings, always making sure his mother had enough wood and supplies. Grace appreciated their concern, but what she really wanted was Wade. She wanted his arms around her at night, his voice reading to her by firelight, his presence filling the spaces that now felt so terribly empty. Spring came, and summer, and Grace went through the motions of living. She tended her garden, preserved food for winter, mended clothes. The children and grandchildren visited, bringing life and noise into the quiet cabin. But at night, Grace would wrap herself in the grizzly hide blanket and weep for the man who had made it, for her so many years ago, who had saved her life and then made it worth living. The second winter without Wade was approaching when Grace fell ill. It was nothing dramatic, just a cold that settled in her chest and would not leave, exactly like the illness that had taken Wade. The doctor from town came to examine her and shook his head gravely. "Mrs. Ashford, you need to fight this," he said. "Your family needs you." But Grace was tired. Tired of being cold without Wade to warm her, tired of the ache in her chest that had nothing to do with illness and everything to do with loss. She had lived a long, full life. She had known great love and great happiness, and now she was ready to rest. She told the children as much, gathered them around her bed, and explained that she was not afraid, that she had no regrets, that she had been blessed beyond measure. "But Ma, you cannot give up," Sarah said, crying. "I am not giving up," Grace said gently. "I am just ready to go home to Wade." She died on a quiet December evening, with the snow falling softly outside and her children gathered around her. Her last words were, "I am warm now," and she died with a smile on her face, wrapped in the grizzly hide blanket that had been her first gift from the man she loved. They buried her next to Wade on the hillside, and the whole family gathered again, 3 generations united in their grief. But there was also gratitude, appreciation for the incredible woman who had taken a desperate situation and turned it into a legacy of love and strength. William inherited the cabin and the land, and he maintained it carefully, preserving it as a monument to his parents' love. The grizzly hide blanket was passed down through the family, each generation treasuring it, knowing the story of how it had saved Grace's life that first terrible winter, how it had been a symbol of Wade's love and protection. The story of Grace and Wade became family legend, told and retold to children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. The story of how a mountain man had found a freezing, desperate woman and saved her life. How he had turned a grizzly hide into a blanket so she could sleep warm for the first time in years. How that simple act of kindness had blossomed into a love that lasted a lifetime and created a legacy that endured long after they were gone. In the mountains of Montana, where the winters are harsh and the land is unforgiving, their story lived on. A reminder that love can bloom in the most unexpected places, that kindness can save a life, that warmth can be found even in the coldest circumstances. That two people who had been alone and lost had found each other and built something beautiful that would last for generations. The cabin still stands, maintained now by William's great-grandson, a young man who never knew his great-great-grandparents, but who honors their memory by keeping their home intact. And in a place of honor on the bed is an old, worn, grizzly hide blanket, patched and mended and treasured beyond measure. Because it is more than just a blanket, it is a symbol of salvation and love, of a desperate winter and the man who would not let a woman die alone. It is the physical embodiment of the moment Grace Hartwell's life changed forever, the night she slept warm for the first time in years and began to believe that maybe, just maybe, she had a future worth living. And in the end, she had more than just a future. She had a lifetime of love with a man who saw her, valued her, cherished her. She had children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried her strength and Wade's determination in their blood. She had been cold and alone and certain she would die, and instead, she had lived fully and loved deeply and left behind a legacy that would endure, as long as the mountains themselves. The grizzly hide blanket, worn and treasured, remains a testament to that love, to the mountain man who made it and the woman who slept warm beneath it, to the life they built together in the harsh beauty of the Montana wilderness, to a love story that began with survival and ended with legacy, with warmth in the coldest place, with light in the darkness, with hope when there seemed to be none. And somewhere, perhaps in whatever comes after, Grace and Wade are together again, warm and safe and home at last, wrapped in each other's arms the way they were meant to be for all eternity.